I'm Marty Bragg. I'm the Director of Health and Counseling Services here at Cal Poly, and I'd like to welcome you to this evening's program. We're really so fortunate to have Margaret Bertram with us tonight, and she's here through her affiliation and our affiliation with Active Minds and through our campus Cal MHSA grant. This grant has been designed to help increase awareness of mental health issues, including increased help seeking, peer-to-peer support, and stigma reduction. This grant is funded through Voter-Approved Mental Health Services Act, which you may know as Prop 63. And through this grant, we've already been able to host events like Art with Impact, Strike Out the Stigma, and then in the fall, and again in conjunction with our Active Minds chapter, we'll be hosting Send the Silence Packet. Active Minds is a student organization that began in Pennsylvania in the early 2000s. By a college student who lost a brother to suicide and was committed to helping reduce the likelihood of that in the future. In 2003, Active Minds became an official club for colleges nationwide and has become the voice of young people in mental health advocacy on over 350 campuses. Through the hard work of our health educator, Rogine Dominguez, her graduate assistant, Emily Robbins, and the many students on our campus with a passion for advocacy, Active Minds was established at Cal Poly this year, and I thank you all for your work on that. Now I'm excited to introduce Maggie. Maggie grew up in Central Illinois, in small town Central Illinois, where everybody knows each other's business. Having grown up in rural Indiana, I'm completely familiar with that concept. In this small town atmosphere, Maggie was practiced at projecting confidence, maturity, and success while, secretly struggling with anxiety and perfectionism, and then which continued through college, where she struggled also with shame associated with discovering her lesbian identity, and during that time dealt with major depression, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and anorexia nervosa. This evening, she will discuss her journey toward a more positive and integrated life, and we really are thrilled to introduce Margaret Bertram. Margaret?
So there's a reason I didn't use the podium. I really appreciate that introduction from Marty, and so glad to be here with you all. I was talking earlier to some folks. Most of the time I am speaking in Ohio and New York. Those seem to be the states that really like me, and as wonderful as both of those states are, and people I love live in them, this is way more pretty. So thank you for sharing your campus with me for today. I'm really happy to be here. I'm wondering, I guess, off the bat, because that was such a thorough introduction, whether you all have any questions, because we could just stop now, I think. I don't know that there's much more to know. I do. I work for a national organization called Active Minds, and we actually just went over the 400 chapter mark. And not only are they all across the US, but we have some in Canada and one chapter in Australia. Pride of Australia. And we do all kinds of programming. We do some programming through our chapters. We do different awareness campaigns, Eating Disorders Awareness Week, something called National Stress Out Day, National Day Without Stigma. We also have a program called Post Secret You. We work with Frank Warren, who created the Post Secret blog, and it's an on-campus version of his blog, which is pretty cool. You heard too that Send Silence Packing will be here in the fall, and that was the brainchild of my boss, Allison Malman, who founded our organization. She lost her brother Brian to suicide when she was a freshman in college. He was a senior at Columbia University, and he was the guy that everybody knew. He was active, he was the president of his a cappella group, he wrote on the campus newspaper, he wrote for the sports column, and Brian was a popular guy, and he was a successful guy. And he came home partway through his senior year, and they diagnosed him with schizoaffective disorder. And though he got into treatment at that point, he had been struggling for about 4 years, silently. And less than a year later, he died by suicide. And in Allison's journey to make sense of her brother's suicide, she set up just a campus organization at the University of Pennsylvania, the very first chapter of Active Minds. And that has clearly caught on. There are a lot of people who think that this is an issue that should be talked about. And generally those people are either A, folks who are struggling themselves, or B, people who know someone who's struggling. And on a college campus, that's pretty common, more common than you might think. 1 in 4 college students struggles with a mental health disorder in a given year. 25%, say, of your campus population will struggle with a diagnosable mental health disorder. And when I was in college, no one talked about mental health. There wasn't an Active Minds chapter. In fact, I had no idea what services were available or really even thought about mental health. So I'm sure that you all are going to blow me away tonight. I am going to throw out some questions to the audience. Feel free to shout them out. Keep in mind, I was a high school teacher for a while, and I've been a college instructor, and I will wait for answers. So when I say mental health, what do you think of?
DSM.
The DSM, in the news. But that, of course, is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which has been in the news. There's some controversy over it. What else do you think of?
Overall state of psychological well-being.
Overall state of psychological well-being. Okay. That could be a dictionary definition. Yeah. What else do you think of? Just random things. What pops in your head? Mental health. Depression. Bipolar.
Anxiety.
Anxiety. Stigma. What's stigma? Discrimination against someone who has mental illness and negative associations with that. Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the things that you're calling out are things that are attributable to that. I said mental health, and we, for the most part, talked about mental health disorders, right? Depression is a mental health disorder. Bipolar disorder is a mental health disorder. And a lot of times when I go to campuses, folks will talk about whatever weird thing has happened with like Lindsay Lohan. Like, that's what they'll shout out at me as an example of mental health and what comes to mind. But you're right. All of these things have to do with our mental health. How many of you are here for a class, to get credit for a class? How many of you need to write a paper? Okay, so I'm gonna help you out. So these are all things you can write in your paper. Are your pencils ready? Okay. I am not a mental health expert. And what's going through your mind now is, why am I here? The second thing that you need to know is that I have struggled with 3 mental illnesses over the course of my lifetime. And that's what we're going to talk about here tonight. But the other important thing that you need to know, other than the fact that you already wrote down about 1 in 4 students struggling with a mental health disorder, is that when people like Brian, Allison's brother, get help early on, they tell somebody that something's wrong, and they get the help that they need, most of them can go back to living completely fulfilling lives. There's an amazing response rate of the mind to treatment when these things are caught early. But if 25% of the Cal Poly population outside these doors has a diagnosable mental health disorder, how many of those do you think seek help? Let's go with a percentage. 5%, 10%? 2%? 3%? Why so low?
Stigma.
Stigma, the thing that keeps people from seeking help. Why else in more feelings type terms?
It shows that you have a problem, or like, it's like, hey, I have a problem.
It shows that you have a problem, so other people perceive that you have a problem.
Yeah.
You also have to admit that you have a problem. Double whammy. What else? Why else don't people seek help? Why are you guessing so low?
Embarrassment.
Embarrassment?
They're too busy.
They're scared they're too busy? Good.
Lack of knowledge or education, like contributing it to others is way easier.
Right, lack of knowledge, education about mental health. Anything else?
Lack of resources.
Lack of resources. Good.
Not knowing your resources.
Not knowing your resources. Both not good.
Not having hope that it will change anything.
Good. Not having hope that it'll change anything, that it's already too late. And I'll tell you that one of the leading cause, the only one that we haven't touched on here from the research, is that people don't perceive, even when they're having suicidal ideation, there are college students who do not perceive that things are bad enough to get help. That it has to be worse. That they have to be in crisis. And we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight, and what keeps people out of treatment services, what keeps people from telling their friends, from telling their family, from letting that stigma take over. Now, you all were a little low. It's about 33% of college students of that quarter will go seek help. That's 2/3 that aren't seeking help, however, and it's often, like I said, those who need it the most who are not seeking help. Now, I heard a little bit about embarrassment and shame and stuff like that, and I think it comes a lot, at least for me, from expectations. I think it all comes back to expectations, something that we can all kind of identify with. How many of you feel like your family or friends have high expectations for you and what you're going to do here? Okay. How many of you hold high expectations of yourself and what you're going to do here? Even more hands. Good. High expectations can be good. They can be motivating. I grew up in a small town, as you heard. Anyone from small towns in here? All right. It was central Illinois, so it was about 7,000 people. I think there were probably more livestock on the farms that surrounded the town than people who actually lived in it. I'm not kidding. Pigs, cows, sheep, everything. And so everybody knew each other's business, and especially when you got into high school, like high school sports took up half the town paper. It's like big pictures of like the golf team, like an action shot of the golf team, and like, I like golf. Action shots? Look at the putt. But they showed up and everybody's name was splashed all over the papers, and you grew up with expectations in that kind of an environment. Everybody had an expectation, a role to fill. And so there are people who were good at school, there were people who were good at athletics, music, theater. There were people who grew up knowing that they were expected to be a screw-up, even. That was their role, early on. I learned my role early on as well. I was supposed to be good in school. And living in a small town, I got put into the gifted program at my school, which essentially meant that it was supposed to be a really creative environment where you could work in groups with other students who were advanced, whatever that meant. And really, it was a snake pit of competition. We used to take these time tests in math, so like multiplication tables or something like that, and you would have a specific amount of time, and you would do as many as you could, and then you would trade with the person next to you, and you would go through and you would grade the time test, and then that person would shout out your score to the rest of the room. And if you were sort of at the top of those grades, you know, you just kind of sat up straight, and you know, you kind of played it cool, except for Kenny, he would jump up out of his seat in early 90s fashion and go, yes! It was a very full house at the time, which I saw in live runs, and you probably see only on Nick at Night. Or ABC Family, which is where I still watch those. But the people who didn't do as well, you know, they blushed and like slinked down in their chairs, and they felt ashamed that they didn't do as well as everybody else in the class, and that's kind of how it went. Now I was lucky, first world, 6th grade problems, right? Like I was lucky that I usually had one of the higher grades in the class, and I just didn't have to do anything about it. But I remember 6th grade science class, we had to do a weather book, which was essentially drawing clouds and precipitation. I'm not very good at drawing things. And I didn't do so well on that assignment, and I got it back. And it was one of the first times I can recall being the person who was like slumping down in her seat and really embarrassed. And my mom came to pick me up from school, and I was clearly upset, but I didn't want to talk to her about it. And she took me into my science teacher's classroom, and they were both demanding to know what was wrong. And I didn't know what to say. I felt embarrassed that I was upset, felt embarrassed about the grade, and I started to cry. And my mom took me aside into the corner of the room. She's like, "You can't do this anymore. You can't just cry when stuff like this happens." And best intentions in the world. My mom, I was in middle school. You don't cry in middle school. You will get ridiculed. You get ridiculed for much less. And being the overachiever that I was, I learned that lesson really well. I also learned there was this thing called Midwestern modesty. So like you were never outwardly happier than anyone else around you. You were sort of only as happy as the saddest person in the room. It wasn't okay to be angry. It really wasn't okay to be too frustrated. You just didn't show those emotions. And so you packed them down, at least I did, into myself, because what I knew is that people wanted to see the put together, successful me. The straight A student, the athlete, the musician, that's who they wanted to see. They wanted to see the person that they came to for help because I was so put together. And so all those emotions kept getting stuffed down in me, and I'm not, like, I can't stand behind the podium. There's not a whole lot of place to put all those emotions. And sometimes they would just boil over. And I would apologize, but it wasn't a solution. It never really made me feel any better. But people liked me. People thought I was successful. And as I went through high school, I learned that, especially if I could start to read what people wanted me to do, the decisions that they wanted me to make, that I could please them even more. So everything, you know, from what I was going to major in college, to where I was going to go to college, all the way down to what I was going to have for dinner, I based on the people around me. How many of you have friends, you're all trying to find a place to go out to dinner, and they're the person who's like, "I don't care, I'll go wherever, you get whatever you want to do." Every time. How many of you are that person? I was that person. And there were plenty of like half Hawaiian, half mushroom and green olive pizzas during high school because Marcy and the other Maggie couldn't decide which one they fought over which one it should be. So it was half and half. And pineapple is always on the whole pizza. So just a lesson in life. Can't get rid of the flavor of pineapple and green olive is not so tasty. But it made them happy. And that's what was important. So I went to college with that mentality, that whole sort of dichotomy. There was all the feelings that were inside, all the things that I really wanted to try and do and be. And on the outside, it was what everybody else wanted me to be. And you know what? You can be pretty darn successful when you're being that person. And I liked that success. It made me feel good about myself. But it didn't really honor who I was, and so I got to college and I didn't know how else to be. And I wasn't playing sports anymore, but I was close enough to home that they still published the dean's list for my college in my town newspaper. That was a bad part of the college decision. And so I continued to try to be the student I was in high school, but there's this whole like big fish in a small pond to a small fish in a big pond kind of thing that happened. And I had to work that much harder. And I got really panicked that this whole identity that I had created for myself was gonna get cracked, that I was gonna fail, and that I wasn't gonna live up to the expectations that people had of me. I was wound pretty tightly. And so I started making up these really rigid routines for myself. I would get up at the same time every day, I would study at the same times, I would eat at the same times with the same people, I would exercise at the same times. Everything was the same every day of the week. And syllabus week, which was everybody's happiest week of the semester, was the part of the semester that I dreaded most, because I would get my syllabi and I would see when all of the exams and papers were due, and I would start researching for those papers first thing. By the second week, I was starting on those papers, if I could. And it would be done 3 weeks out from the due date. And I would revise it and revise it. I would obsess over commas and semicolons and word choices and all that kind of stuff, trying to make it perfect. And I would work right up until the deadline. And I would get that paper back. I would see the good grade. I would smile. And then I would move on to whatever that next thing was, and I'd start it. There's really no joy in it for me. But it was what I had to do to continue to be successful, to not be a failure. At the same time, I got to the end of my sophomore year and I realized that doing all of that isn't actually college, or at least how college had been explained to me. There were supposed to be like things that I did with people. And I had friends, but I just never went out with them. Like, they were the friends I had meals with, and the friends that I saw every once in a while in my room. But I wasn't going out and like doing things on campus with them, because I was studying. And I got to the end of my sophomore year, and I sat down with my friend Chelsea, who I was rooming with over the summer. We were both working on campus, and we both looked at each other like, man, we're lost. We had no idea how we had gotten to the end of our sophomore year and not had all of the experiences that we anticipated that we were gonna have. And we thought, what could help us? And like any good Midwestern women who had magazine subscriptions, we decided that there was a Cosmo solution to actually lose weight and land yourself a man. Those were the two solutions that we came up with. And so, like good Cosmo girls, we ran off with whatever the exercise plan that was in the pages of those magazines. And we had both been athletes, and we worked out together and stuff like that. We both started to lose some weight, got ourselves on a little diet, and we started feeling better about ourselves. Started feeling more confident, started feeling better about our bodies, all that kind of thing. And that was great. For about the first 6 weeks, it was awesome. Felt like an athlete again. Now, in terms of landing a man, I have a theory about relationships. And it works like this. There are 3 people in every relationship, particularly in college. So, 1, there are the pursuers. They're the people who like to go after people and like are attracted to them and just like pursue them. How many of you are pursuers? It's okay, it's a safe space. All right. 2, they're the pursued. They're the people who like being chased after and like feeling special. How many of you are the pursued? I didn't see enough looking around so that you all can make some love connections tonight. It's okay, because there's still a third person who can help you out, and it is the best friend who brokers the deal between the pursuer and the pursued. How many of you are always the best friend? You're my people. You're my people. I had a huge crush on Russ, who lived upstairs from me. He was a swimmer, and he liked to listen to jam bands, which when I was in college was dreamy. And Russ and I would hang out, and we had a really great time together, really good rapport. And one day we were hanging out, and he was like, "Oh, I really like Molly." And Molly was my friend. And I was like, "Oh yeah?" And I'm like, "Oh, I've heard this before." And he's like, "Yeah, what do you think she thinks of me?" And I was like, I don't know. And so then you go over and you're like, "Okay, Molly, hey, do you know my friend Russ?" "Yeah." "What do you think of him?" And it's like back and forth. It's like, "I really want to ask her out on a date." "Well, she was dating that guy up until like 3 days ago. Do you think it's a little early to like be moving in?" "Well, I don't know. Will you find out?" "So how's the getting over Mike going?" And back and forth and back and forth. And Russ and Molly have been married for 4 years, and so I guess I did a good job. And that's great for them, but it left me alone on Saturday night. So about 6 weeks into the summer, my replacement at work, Divya, my friend, came in and she was like, "Hey, I know someone who likes you." And I was like, "Ah!" Like, mind is off, 100 miles a minute, and just like, "Oh, who could it be? Like, who's on campus this summer?" And like, it could be people doing research, it's not necessarily people working with us, and blah, 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 blah. Like, going. Trying to rack my brain about who this was, because of course, Divya was doing the super mature thing about like, giving me clues and like teasing me like, "Oh, whatever." I was too busy thinking about all of the different possibilities. And finally she's like, "It's my roommate, Sarah." And I was like, everything stopped. I had to like reboot my brain. And I was like, "Oh, that's flattering." And then she continued to tease me for a while longer and talk about all the different things that Sarah had said about me. And I'm sure I was bright red, and I was just like, "You know what? I need to go." It's summer. There's nowhere to go in Bloomington, Illinois at 6 o'clock in the summer. And I was like, I got a thing. And I was like, what? So I'm like rebooting my brain, walking back to my room, and I'm like, what is this? Like, I had never known any gay people. I'd only known gay jokes. Like, that's all that I ever heard from the junior high boys in my hometown were gay jokes. And so, and the thing is like, there were no gay people in my town. And by that I mean, if you were gay, you moved out of my town to be gay. Right? Because no one wanted to live where I grew up and deal with the whispering and like the jokes and the comments and the ostracism, none of that, right? And so I just had no frame of reference. I grew up in a house where like my parents were super open and great, but when you're surrounded by people who think otherwise, you don't really know what to think. And I was like, I'm flattered. I've been wanting to catch someone's attention, and it's really not that big of a deal, and it'll blow over. I just need a distraction. Need a really good distraction. And you know how, like, especially in college, like, a lot of people cope with their issues with alcohol or drugs sometimes, or like really risky behaviors? I sort of self-medicated with the exercise that I was doing. And I started preoccupying myself with how I can pare down what I was eating. Really getting good at the diet and exercise thing, and it helped numb out all of these questions that had been raised in my mind by Divya coming into work and telling me that Sarah thought I was cute. So I got to the end of the summer, and I had been selected as an RA, so we had training before everybody came back to campus, and we spent an hour with our counseling center. And they came in, they showed us a whole list of things that we should be looking for in our residents, if we should encourage them to go to counseling. And I spent the next 55 minutes ticking off and rethinking about all of the things that applied to me. Not getting joy out of the things that I used to enjoy, change in my sleeping patterns, changes in my eating patterns, changes in my exercise patterns, obsessiveness, being really stressed out about academics, really feeling the urge and the need to be perfect in every way. And I'm looking at this thing and I'm like, oh God. And I took it home and it sat on my desk for a few days while I contemplated what to do. Because I don't know about how you all were introduced to mental health or mental health services, but in my upbringing, it was a kind of a punishment. It was like, if you act out like that again, we're sending you to a therapist. Not like you're going to be grounded or blah, blah, blah. Like, we will send you to a therapist. Which seems to indicate that that is a bad thing. And that it means that I wasn't right, I wasn't good enough, that I wasn't okay. So I had a huge conflict, and I continued to think about what it would be like if one of my residents needed help, and what if I referred them but wouldn't go myself, and wasn't I critical, and I'm pretty in my head and analytical. And finally, on a whim, I just went. I found a time when I waited for people to empty out of the quad that the counseling center was on, and slipped in the door. And started to meet with someone every week. Now it was great because here, I could go, I could get services, they were free, and I was working with someone who actually wanted to work with college students, so that was a major bonus for me, and knew about college students. And I really liked her. And for the next 6 weeks, I started to make some progress in terms of the academic stuff that had been so hard for me. Started breaking all those routines and patterns. I was feeling better about myself. I was realizing that I didn't need to do all of that ritualistic nonsense to still do well, which freed me up to do fun things with my friends. Now, I didn't touch any of the questioning that I had about Sarah and that whole business. I didn't touch any of the food issues and the exercise issues, but I was feeling a lot less anxious, and that was a win. And my friends were really good friends. They were noticing that there were all kinds of changes to my routines, to my schedules, to all that kind of stuff when I was seeing them. And they said, not that we're complaining, because they were seeing me more often, but what's going on? And I hadn't really made up a good lie yet about where I had been going and why these changes were taking place, so I just blurted it out. And was like, I've been going to see a counselor at the counseling center about 6 weeks. And just waited for judgment. Because, we talked about stigma, it's coming out as going to seek counseling. That's what it felt like. And so I was kind of waiting for them to openly mock me, or reject me in some way, or just be silent and then act like they were a little bit afraid. Is it contagious? And one of my friends was like, oh yeah, who are you seeing? Because I saw so-and-so last year and she was awesome. And she wanted to compare notes about how our sessions were going. And everybody was just sort of yeah, okay, next story. It's almost time to watch whatever crappy TV show is on tonight. And I was sort of no, there was a part of me that was no, I told you crazy person. And they were just you're fine and you're doing better, this is great. You seem great. right, let's go watch Dawson's Creek. And we did. All the way to the end. Even after it got really bad. It was always really bad. I know. That felt good, and it empowered me to tell my parents I am an only child. I'm an only child who grew up in a small town. Yep, I had issues. And they were really supportive, and that felt good. And so I was sort of on this upward trajectory. And I started my second semester of my junior year, just to place a marker in time for all of you who are taking notes. It's probably like a one-page response. You'd be like, she's good, I think. I was bored at this part. I just remember writing those. They were the worst. Maybe we can, in question and answer, you can ask me how to write the rest of your thing. We can make up a killer opening line. But anyway, we're at the second semester of my junior year, and I was a history major. I was in Asian studies concentration. So we were putting together a huge campus-wide Lunar New Year celebration, and I was working with some friends, and one of them was my friend Karen, who was also an RA, and we had never really talked that much before. Up until that point, we just sort of like had different classes and things together. And we found that we had a lot in common, so we started hanging out. And a few weeks in, I was like, Karen's nice. And my roommates were like, yep. I was like, that's all. She was pretty and easy to be around, and that thing happened where like sort of like your heart feels like it drops in your stomach when you see that person. And you do that sort of college thing, or at least the thing that was a college thing on my campus, which was you'd sit in the coffee shop where everybody mostly walked through to get to the dining hall all day long, and then you wait for them to be there. And you'd be like, hey! Even like if you were sitting at a table like we were like, hey! Hi, just got here. Can I get you a cup of coffee? Do I seem a little bit wound? I haven't been sitting here drinking coffee all day long, pretending to read this political science homework, though the anti-federalist papers are really interesting. Would you like to discuss them? I wanted to create those serendipitous moments and run into her. It was college stalking. It wasn't obsessive, it was just what you do, right? I took plenty of my friends to go do the same thing while they were waiting for dudes, so it came fine. And before I knew it, I was totally just fell for her, right? And that freaked me out. The first thing I think I thought of when I realized it, and right after she and I started sort of secretly dating, because in addition to not talking about mental health on campus, it was like there were gay people, but no one really talked about it. And so we started sort of secretly dating, and the first thing I thought of was like my mom. So ever since I'm not that much taller today than I was then, but she, we'd walk vacation or something, we'd walk into a church, and she'd be like, oh, this would be a nice place for you to get married. And I remember thinking, and I was like, oh my God, there wasn't another chick there with me. There was definitely a dude in that fantasy. How this, and I just started to try to block it out again, except Karen, who I was dating, ever-present reminder of the fact that I really liked her. And that sent me into kind of a tailspin. I ate less and less, and I exercised more and more. And the thing about that is that people would come up to me and be like, wow, have you lost weight? You look really good. And given the fact that I felt like a complete failure for the secret that I had about being gay, I was like, you think this is good? I can do better. I can succeed at this. I was a perfectionist at creating that outward me that everybody liked. So I exercised more and more, and I ate less and less, and there are a lot of people who I come in contact with when I go out and speak who are like, I don't really understand that. And so the only thing that I can liken it to is that, so I have this friend, Katie, who does a lot of driving for work, and so if you get in a car with her, she'll put in the destination on the GPS, and the estimated time of arrival will show up in the corner, and every time, the first words out of her mouth, we can beat that. It's like 6 or 7 hours in the car with her, and there are no stops. And you're sort of like white knuckling it the whole time, and it's a little bit dangerous. You know, weaving in and out of traffic. I think probably something about this. I shouldn't trust her. That's kind of the situation that I was in with myself. I came out to my parents later in that semester after having come out to my friends, Courtney, Katie, and Megan, who are my rocks, my support system. And all three of them had pretty much the same response, which was, oh my God, that's great, finally. Someone like recognizes how wonderful you are, and we're so excited for you, and tell us all about it, and all that kind of stuff. And so I had a really good support system going into telling my parents, but I didn't really know how this was gonna go. Like I said, my parents had never said anything bad, they'd never said anything good, they just didn't know that they knew any gay people, I think. And so we just never had that conversation, and I sat down with my mom, and I felt like I was failing her, and I just cried. And slowly, bits and pieces came out to her, and she told me she loved me, and then she calmed my dad down. And I was still crying, just sobs and sobs, and I came out to him. And I think there are a couple of things that when you're coming out, I've talked to tons and tons of people about this, is that you can pretty much boil down the thought process about what you fear when you come out to a couple of different responses. The first one is fearing that people will just outright reject you and tell you, like, you're a sinner, and you're awful, and you're disgusting, and all that kind of stuff. And the other one is that they will be silent and just sort of like judging you or rejecting you, but not wanting to do it outwardly, because that wouldn't be the cool thing to do. And my dad was silent. And that made me cry harder. And then after a little while, my mom was comforting me, and he just got up and left. And I really saw that as a not so overt judgment of me. And my parents didn't disown me. It's not one of those kinds of stories. They were still very supportive, and in fact, they supported everything about me throughout the whole rest of that semester and into the next year, except for that piece of me we never talked about it. And so it was the thing that, it was like a black mark, it was the failure. It was a stamp of failure, it was the thing that cracked that perfect facade, and I didn't know how to deal with that. I went and studied abroad in China and came back for my senior year to do some student teaching. And my first therapy appointment back, my therapist was like, whew. I mean, she was right. Like, when I looked in the mirror, I didn't recognize myself. I legit did not recognize myself. I knew it was me, but I looked awful. And people would stop saying, hey, if you lost some weight, you look really good. Because it didn't look really good. And so she's like, I really feel like you need some medical attention. And she got me an appointment with the psychiatrist. And I walked in, sat down, did some screenings and things, and I walked out with 3 diagnoses. Major depression, so all that stuff about isolating myself and pushing my friends away and not taking joy in the things that I really enjoyed. I'm really starting to push everything of value to me out of my life. That's what was going on. I was sleeping a lot. Second was obsessive compulsive disorder, and that was related to anorexia nervosa. Those are 2 things that are often diagnosed together. Because I was obsessing with what was coming in and going out of my body, and I felt compelled to exercise more and more every day. Because in my head, it was like I thought that missing one day was just going to ruin everything. Everything that I worked for, everything that I was being successful at. Now, there were a few things that I needed to do. I like action plans. I played basketball. Knowing plays, things like that, running the floor. I was a point guard because, hello, again, with the height. So I ran the plays, ran the floor, and so I came out with a plan. And basically, I needed to continue seeing my therapist. I was like, great, I like my therapist, wonderful. Second thing is I needed to take some medication. So we sat down. We talked about all of the different types of medication and what might work best for me and what I was comfortable with, which was monitored really closely, and I walked out feeling pretty good about that. And then the last thing was I needed to curb my activity level. I wasn't supposed to exercise any more than it took me to walk to class and back home. And I was like, okay, I got an action plan, I can do this, I will not fail at this. So I was student teaching, I was doing a number of different things back on campus, finishing out my senior year, and things started happening. So I was working in a public school, I had no air conditioning, I was cold all day long, even when it was 80 degrees in the room. And there were times when I would stand up from my desk to go help a student, and I would get dizzy, and I actually fell once in front of my students. And you'd think that that would indicate to me that something was really wrong and that something needed to change. But it didn't. And even though I was going to therapy and I was taking my medications, I couldn't stop exercising. And one day toward the end of the semester, one of my students, I walked by, I was helping her with her homework, and she said, you know, Ms. Bertram, you are so pretty, you're just so skinny, I wish I could be as skinny as you. And I knew in my head, no you don't. And you'd think, as someone who really valued my students and who was going to be a teacher, that that would be rock bottom, and I would stop, and I would commit to that action plan, but it wasn't. And the thing is the relationship with your body is like your relationship with a best friend or a significant other, is if you keep lying to them and telling them that you're going to come through for them and just covering up with I love you, after a while they stop trusting you and the relationship falls apart. And so the relationship with my body started to fall apart in the first part of my last semester of my senior year. I walked in and I had gotten some blood work done, which was routine. And sitting in the office with my psychiatrist and my therapist and my parents. Surprise! It was a party for me. And I sat down and I was like, what? Because at this point, I was a complete and utter jerk. I was so cranky about people wanting to help me at this point, that I was just like, here it comes, what do you want? I had pushed all my friends away, advisors had reached out, my parents had clearly tried to reach out, what do you want? And they said, we're going to put you in the hospital for 3 days. And I kind of took it sort of stoically. It was like, all right, well, it's Thursday, that means I can be back in class on Monday. It's literally the thought process I had. And my psychiatrist was like, I don't think you really understand, we took your blood, your body is basically attacking itself at this point. Your heart is very weak, you could have a heart attack at any time, and if you do, you are not strong enough to survive it. You basically have one foot in the grave. And I was like, okay, that should have been rock bottom. It wasn't. I went to the hospital and I basically did whatever they wanted me to do because I was bound and determined to graduate on time. I wasn't going to spend all of my time in a hospital. I did everything they told me to do for 3 days, and I went back in for that evaluation to get released, and they said, you're actually worse off than when you came in. My body was something that they refer to in the eating disorder realm as hyperburn. So no matter how much I was taking in, I just couldn't take in enough to balance what my body was disposing of. My metabolism was way high. And I said, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to do about it? And they said, you're 22 years old, you need to voluntarily check yourself into treatment, like a residential treatment facility. And I was like, no, you can't make me. And I then proceeded to scream things at my parents that I'm fairly sure that there were phrases and words that they didn't know that I knew. I had never been so angry at them. I had never outwardly said anything to them that was so severe. And I had never seen them look so scared of anything, let alone me, in that moment. And so I was ticked off, and I went back to my room, and I told them I didn't want to talk to them, and I would see them tomorrow when I got out. My friend Courtney, who was the first person I came out to, came and visited me that night, and she sat with me while I talked to her about all of it, and how ticked off I was, and angry, and they don't believe in me, and I can do this, and blah, 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 blah. And she sat there, and she listened to the whole thing, and she said, listen, I know that you're really afraid of not graduating on time and failing, and I would feel the same way. I guess it's really pretty selfish, because I'm really afraid that if you walk out of here tomorrow, you're not going to graduate. I'm going to lose my friend. And I guess that's for me to sit with. She's like, I think it's just really important that you think about this and you make a decision based on what you want to do. And so she sat there and held my hand and talked me through some more reasoned discussions about it. And she left that night, and where we left it was, for the first time in as long as I can remember, I had a decision to make. Because she said, either way, you go back to school, you go into treatment, I'm there for you. You come live with me if you don't go to treatment. We'll figure it out. The next day I checked myself into treatment. Honestly, I think it was a realization that I actually could die, and that I actually cared whether I did or not. Neither had been the case up to that point. And I was scared, and I figured I may as well give it a shot. So I checked myself into treatment, and worked with a nutritionist and a doctor and a psychiatrist and a therapist. But I think the most important time that I spent there was in group therapy, because I was surrounded by people who were all struggling with eating disorders, but they were like from all different backgrounds. There were men and women, all different ages, and we all sort of told our truths. Whether it was us telling our story of what was going on with us, or it was the not oftentimes so subtle remarks back to people who would share things and be like, you're an idiot! And it was like all the things that a therapist can't say. It's like, that's really stupid! And it was great, because I'm a direct person, and I felt like people have been walking on eggshells with me for months, for years. Because they're afraid they were going to break me. And so, finally it was my turn to share, and I realized that the one thing that had been standing in the way of me getting a handle on my anxiety, on my depression, on my eating disorder, had been the fact that I was still, even though everyone else in my life had come to accept that I was gay, I still was shaming myself for being gay. And this was my punishment. I was punishing myself. And so, once again, I was in a room full of people coming out, and I had the same two fears about what the response would be. And there were actually like several beats of silence after I finished, and I was like, oh my God. Because like if they had been overtly, awful to me, it could at least be like, oh, you're a bunch of bigots, I'm righteous, whatever. And, but it was just silent, and I was like, oh my God, what's gonna happen? And then one of the women to my right was like, tell us more about your girlfriend. And I was like, what? like, what's she like? Like, what do you guys do together? What do you have in common? How's that going? And I was like, well, we broke up because I got miserable to spend time with. And I'm like, oh, let's talk about that. You really perked up. We want to fix your relationship. You really perked up when you were talking about her. It was like a non-issue. It wasn't even like, it's like they didn't even really acknowledge. And like halfway through, I was like, excuse me, I just came out to you. I am gay. And they were like, we know. And I was like, why doesn't anybody have a problem with that? And they were like, because it's not a problem. And it was just like that simple for them. And that was the first step for me of sort of realizing that really the only person who had a true problem among the people who cared about me with my sexuality was me, and I was the only one who could do something about that. So it's not, I left treatment, and what I've learned from all of these years of doing this kind of work and to talking to students like you is that there is no lowest bar for going and seeking that help. Like, there's no bar to clear. Like, something needs to be wrong, you need to be concerned about it, it needs to be something that you feel like you want to talk about, and that you need some help getting through. And I seek that help when I need it. Things have gotten better with my parents, too. We didn't talk about, my being gay for a couple of years after I came out to them. And I was lucky to find a really awesome faith community in the town I was living in after I graduated. And they helped support me through having conversation finally with my parents of bringing up the thing that they didn't want to talk about. And I said, why don't we ever talk about this? Why don't you ever ask about my girlfriend? Why aren't you ever concerned in the way that I would expect? Some of, my friends' parents are so concerned about their love lives and when they're gonna get married. Why don't you ask me? And they said, you've always been so upset. You were upset when you came out, and you've been upset anytime it came up ever since. Then we just didn't want to upset you. And I was like, oh. We're like, we'll talk about it. We do want to know. We have all kinds of questions. And I think, my dad, to be fair, like, I could be dating anyone, and he'd be like, you're dating my daughter. But watch out, I'm watching you. But they've been great and supportive and have certainly been there for me. So I'm super blessed to be in front of all of you today and to be talking to you. I'm super grateful that even though quite a few of you now have papers to write as a result of this, that I have been able to speak with you tonight because I really feel like you all are the folks who are going to change things for people like me from when I was going through all of this in college. You're the people who are going to know something when a friend comes to you and says, like, I'm studying. Like, you could be playing video games, and that's like when it comes out. When people don't have to look at you, but they can talk to you, those are the times when your friends are going to say something. And this is a pretty resource-rich time. There's never going to be a time where it's so easy to seek help for your mental health. It's free. There's really no barriers. There are people who are trained to work with college students in particular, and they're here tonight. It's never going to be so easy, and it's never going to, you're never going to find a more sort of convenient time to do it. You will only get busier. I'm really sorry to admit that to you. And you will only have more responsibilities in your life. So if you're even questioning, if you're even thinking about it, or if you're concerned about a friend, reach out. Tons of resources on your campus. You have peer resources on your campus. You have fantastic health and counseling service. You have community resources with 24-hour hotlines. You have national hotlines. Reach out. You don't have to be the one struggling. I was lucky to have friends that when I came back from the hospital, they sat down with me at the kitchen table after I had pushed them away and given them nothing but grief. And they said, how can we help? You don't have to ruin your life to help somebody else. You don't have to drop everything. But all you have to do is be there. Remind them that you're there when they're ready. When they're ready to talk about it, when they're ready to get walked over to the counseling center, whatever it might be. Because you can't push them into it, but you can be there to help them through it. And I was blessed to have them. So thank you all for your amazing attention tonight. And I will take a few, or as many questions as you have. And I know some of you are on tight schedules, so if you have to sneak out, please do. But it's been amazing talking to you, and thank you so much for having me here. Yes.
I was wondering if you watched the movie called Dangerous Method, when Freud cured the young Russian woman without what you have to do today to help people.
Have I seen Dangerous? I haven't.
You should see it.
Okay.
I encourage people to see it. It's about Freud in Jung treating a young woman whose father was a psychiatrist too.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to put it on the list
Yeah.
once I get back to write things down. I appreciate that, yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
How did you get involved with Dr. Minds?
How did I get involved with Active Minds? Great question. So I was a grad student at the University of Connecticut, and they started a chapter there, and I happened to be doing outreach work in the counseling center, and I got hooked up with the chapter there and started attending events. They have a national conference every November. I went to the national conference, which is where they announced that they were taking on speakers for the Speakers Bureau. So I applied to that and trained and got onto the Speakers Bureau. And then after a couple of years of working in residence life, they posted a job at Active Minds, and it combines working with students and doing sort of creative programming work and stuff like that. And it's just been fantastic. And I get to work with all of these amazing student leaders who are just, they're doing work that a lot of people don't want to do, that they don't want to talk about, and hearing their stories has been incredible. Other questions?
You're also a teacher and a professor.
I was a high school history teacher, and then when I was working on campuses, I was an instructor. I taught some classes, like I taught Intro to Student Affairs, which was like an intro class for students who were thinking about going into a master's level program. And I taught like first year seminars. Yeah, so ever since I've been working on campuses, I've been really open about my past, which I find really invites for students. Like once they feel comfortable enough with me, and you share a little bit about yourself, they'll come and talk to you about what's going on with you, with them, or like a friend. And so I've done a lot of that, definitely. And it's pretty cool.
I know you mentioned that after you finished your treatment, the majority social labs had, it was hard to see you were fully recovered after triggers. Do you know if that's common for people who go through those kinds of rehabs?
My understanding from folks that I've talked to is that kind of it can ebb and flow, and certainly having only gone to treatment once and for a relatively short amount of time compared to what is, I was really lucky in that sense, really, really lucky. And so, I mean, I don't have statistics, and since you know, I'm not an expert, I'm sure that there's someone who actually has the hard answer to that question, but there are certainly triggers, and I certainly have ebbed and flowed, but then for the last 3 years, it's just the anxiety that wells up every once in a while.
What are the best methods that you found at reducing the stigma?
The best methods that I have found to reduce the stigma of mental illness. This is actually one of the best methods that I found is sharing stories, and not just me sharing stories with audiences, but creating venues for students to share stories with each other. So things like Post Secret, where people are just sharing secrets anonymously, is actually a really great way to tear apart some of that stigma in a really safe, anonymous way. But certainly I've helped a lot of our chapters to create like series of panel discussions on different topics where students are telling their stories in safe and effective ways. And I think that is by far one of the best ways. Like once you know someone who has struggled and it's someone who you love or you respect or whatever, it's really hard to continue to have that perception that like these people are weak and they're awful and you know they're violent and all that kind of stuff that gets perpetuated out in the media. So I think by far it's been the most significant way. The biggest joy I have in my life right now? Oh. There's so many ways in which to answer that question. Okay, that's actually pretty easy. So I have an amazing, both my parents are awesome, but I have this amazing network of chosen family. Because as an only child, I kind of built out a family around me among my friends. And so my best friend had her first child a year ago, and I am Lila's godmother. And she lives in Chicago. She's about to live in Milwaukee, and I get videos, and we trade videos, and get pictures, and she just started walking. So right before I came here, there's a picture of her, or the video of her first steps. And so I have a lot to be thankful for, and a lot that brings me joy, definitely, but nothing beats that. She's the best. Any other questions? All right. Well, I will stick around for a little bit because I know that sometimes there are questions that you don't want to ask in front of a bunch of people. But it was a pleasure, and thanks for sticking around for Q&A.